the people who are willing to speak out, at what point do we take it for granted and not understand that getting such people for your society, whether they are from within your society or you get someone who falls in love with the country and is an outsider but is willing to put faith and ride or die with your country. Because I know one or two people to some extent like that, right? Who have made their life and their home here. But of course, Karen is a daughter of the soil, and has been someone who is willing to speak out, even when, generally speaking, most people who speak out, not all, but many, they do so for some sort of professional advancement or some financial consideration, right? And either they are receiving or they are not at risk. And Karen was neither receiving anything, and arguably, in terms of being politically ostracized, she was in great risk. There was very little benefit to her personally to speak on most, if not all of the things that she has spoken about on Talking Point, and even on the show that preceded it. She does it, I believe, because she has genuine concerns. And the reason why I could say that I think her concerns are genuine, that her perspectives are genuine, her opinions are genuine. One, I have seen how she operates, and she does not come across as someone with a great capacity to lie. She seems more like a very straightforward, honest person, maybe even to a fault. She will, if necessary, be more than willing to tell you what she thinks and what she feels, and doesn't seem the type to be able to hide that, mask that, fool you, lie to your face, and manipulate you with all sorts of half-truths or falsehoods. No, she seems to be very much a woman who knows how to be straightforward and honest. That's the educator background more than anything else, which I think is, in many ways, as much as she's a legal scholar and a legal academic attorney at law, it's something about her teaching background which I think informs or molded her more than any other of her professional undertakings. No, I think she is genuine in what she says because she's been consistent throughout the years. Usually one of the easiest ways to figure out who is kind of being disingenuous, who is maybe putting on a front, doing things for show, is you figure it out when you see the inconsistencies. The inconsistencies with regards to, well, why are you taking this position all of a sudden instead of that position? Why is your standards all of a sudden change mysteriously? Why are you showing favor for one group above another? And we started off the show, not everything that the PNM government did was bad, but eventually there was a lot of things we had to speak about. And then when the election happened, it wasn't the case where Karen automatically just gave the new government a free pass. No, she applied the same logic, reasoning, the same foundation, the same process, the same standards to the new government. And I hate to say this, but that sort of thing might be rarer than we would like to think. In a world where people are not just biased, but are attempting to sell their bias as being objective truth and a middle ground, I think one could argue that Karen is one of the people who actually does inhabit the middle ground. And one of my complaints about politics in TNT is that too many people don't live in that space. Many of them choose not to because of the demands of how our politics is set up and run. And the thing is, I mentioned that the Calypso fraternity, they've been reported to be in mourning. 2 veterans this week, Bill Trotman and the Mighty Wanderer, have passed. Meanwhile, again, Sparrow has turned 91. It's not now just about politics, but any one of our willing citizens, willing to speak out, willing to stand in front, not necessarily, I'm not saying that Karen is going to be the best leader or public spokesperson, but she's honest, she's willing, she's genuine, I believe trustworthy, and she brings a certain set of skills and perspectives to a national audience, which is very important. It's important we don't take it for granted, because we just are not going to get, we're not going to get those things back very easily if we ever lose them, if we ever lose the people who bring them to the table. With regards to Calypsonians and other national icons like that, dare I say, we will eventually run into the moment in history where we have lost the last icon from, I guess, the golden age of Calypso. The last link to a past that was in many ways so central to our national identity at that time. And unfortunately, as the conversations I've had with Twiggy and Contender, it might not be quite the same now. And can we ever get that back? Can we ever put our own culture at the center of our own universe? And I guess at the end of the day, it all comes down to don't take things for granted. Don't take our public figures for granted. Don't take the reporter that's willing to step out on a limb and put a politician to task in good faith. Don't take that reporter for granted. The ones that are doing the deep dives and trying to find objective truth, not just build upon rumors and speculation. Don't take that for granted. Don't take what few activists that act in good faith for granted. One of the conversations that I enjoy is, generally speaking, there are activists around the world who they have an agenda and their whole thing is to promote their activism. Not to solve the problem, but to promote the activism behind the problem, to raise funds, and in some cases, as Booker T. Washington, not the wrestler, but the historical figure, has spoken about before, they want to perpetuate the need for their activism. That's why they don't solve anything. And I would argue that locally, I have spoken to local activists, at least those that you have seen more often than others, and they're not like that. They are genuinely trying to make a difference in the lives of everyday people, and they're not looking to overreach into some sort of excess. And on some level, we should be beneficial that there are those looking at various issues in our society, trying to do their best to be the fail-safe when there's nobody else. And in many instances, when you have things like that, what happens when the founder passes away? In some cases, we've seen passes away suddenly. You know, do we just lose such benefits for our citizens because we don't have people able to step up? And in some cases, that has happened. Certain movements were carried on. But I also know of situations where after the passing of an important key figure, an entity, an organization struggles. And that's a whole other debate with regards to succession planning and the like, but I think also you never know what will happen in life. And we get so caught up with the bacchanal of politics that we don't appreciate the people who try to operate in a different way, the people who essentially are keeping things together, and what happens when we lose them. And I think we're too accustomed to our leaders being bacchanalists as opposed to actually having the capacity to lead. And again, I'm not saying Karen is some great Mahatma Gandhi, Dwight Eisenhower, Winston Churchill figure, but she didn't wait on anybody else. She didn't seek out a consensus before she gave an opinion based on what other people concluded. She had her own conclusions. She was willing to step out in front of everybody else to give it because she felt the duty, the responsibility to do so. And on some level, that is a leader. And in many ways, one of the things, dare I say, is this: our political environment is predicated on everybody in lockstep behind the political leader, obeying the political leader. Well, at some point, a successful political leader is going to be too successful, and they're going to be surrounded by yes men and yes women who are not prepared to lead because they spent their entire career not making decisions, but never going against, never providing any sort of constructive criticism to their leaders' decisions. It will happen, if it hasn't happened already. And perhaps one of the things that I believe people in the middle speak about regularly, long before the election, after the election, both parties, TPP not necessarily yet, they're a young party with a lot of young people, so not necessarily concerned about this yet. But the question, of course, is who succeeds the leader who was successful? And we saw how that worked out with regards to the PRM. And we wait with bated breath to see how that will work out with regards to the UNC. And on some level on this show, we spoke about, well, what things were like in the past with leaders from the past. You know, leaders who had their faults. Mr. Manning and Mr. Pandey had their faults. We've acknowledged faults for both leaders on this show. But one of the bits of commentary was, well, Parliament back then, politics back then. And I guess it might be a case where, you know, again, you don't know what you have till it's gone. So I say all that ultimately to come back to that conclusion of we should appreciate our people more. And we should show appreciation for them in life. Not that we need to blow smoke or kiss up, but just whatever genuine appreciation is. Those who are willing to try. Because far too often people, more and more in 2026, are not willing to try. And you might not want to, and I'll get into this after just now, you might not want to buy what former and current members of the PNM are saying with regards to persecution. But from where I said, our political system and structure is engineered to disincentivize or to intimidate people from trying, from speaking out, from engaging in politics in a good faith manner, in an ethical manner, from trying to be a person who operates on merit, truth, and with the best interests of the country at heart. Those things, dare I say, are not as present in our politics as the supporters would like to believe. They might be there more than the critics want to believe, but there's a lot to be desired by how our politics is conducted. Because fears of persecution, I think, in the current modern environment, persisted regardless of which party. And you can make a case where some of it might have been overblown or over-exaggerated. But at the end of the day, this is what individuals who are not insiders of the system consider. Every media personality considers it. When Dr. Thrawley was angry at your question, I am fairly certain, right? It is reasonable to assume that that reporter who asked that question wondered, what does this mean would anything happen to me? Not necessarily with regards to physical safety, at least not always, but professionally. What clique, who supports who in the system is going to push back against what I have to say, etc., etc. Who's trying to cover up what? Who's trying to run cover for who? What topic is not popular? What is trying to be suppressed? All of the commentators and media professionals either have to be concerned about these things, or they're behind closed doors picked a side. And their side will protect them because they will never say anything bad about their side. You can figure out who that is if you pay attention to what certain political scientists or commentators say. How objective are they in all circumstances? So again, people like Karen Shishera, don't take her for granted. It might not seem like she's doing a lot. It might not seem that she's doing anything big or heroic. But just to make the decision, to be willing to speak out, and to try to do so as objective as possible is a lot harder than you think. And in part because our society makes it so, because ultimately speaking, in too many ways, we like it so. Whether we know it or not, whether it's a direct consequence or indirect of our desires, we like it so. And then we wonder, where did it all go wrong? Our thoughts and prayers are with our colleague. As I said, she is hopefully recovering. Hopefully it's nothing greater than what I was told, but I too wait for official word. If she's up to it, of course, she's always welcome to take her place on Talking Point. But don't be surprised if she might still desire some time to recover, to take stock. So if she's here with us, maybe she might be willing to speak about it next week or not. It is all up to her. And speaking of that, also, our colleague that usually joins me on Fridays, Ashraf Ali, well, he's an expert in his field, and his expertise comes with professional responsibilities, so he won't be able to join us today. So I'll just say that up front. But as far as I'm aware, Karen is okay, and we are very grateful for that, and we hope she continues to be in good health. Let's take a break. When we come back, I'll switch gears now to actual current events. Stay tuned. This is Talking Point at WESND Content Capital. Sean Michael Small. We'll be right back after this.
Get ready for Generations of Steel, the sweetest pan show bar none.
Featuring Desperados,
Shell Invaders,
Massey Trinidad All-Stars,
First Citizens Supernovas,
and the pride of the South, Fun Clear. Plus their talented youth bands. Saturday, July 11th.
at the iconic Grandstand, Queen's Park, Savannah.
Showtime, 6 p.m. till 10:30 p.m.
All performing their most exciting and multifaceted repertoire. Coolers allowed.
Early bird tickets.
2 persons on 1 ticket for only $350.
The quadraphonic tickets admits 4 persons for only $600.
The single pan tickets cost only $200.
By public demand, early bird tickets remain till Saturday, 4th July.
Additional $10 off for online purchases.
Children 12 and under, accompanied by an adult. Admission is free. Get yours now. Available at islandetickets.com.
At Crosby St. James.
All Kenny Sports.
All Extra Foods Supermarket.
Westby, Tagarigua, Athletes by the Park.
Jumbo Foods Baratari.
Gag Electrical, opposite Starlight. Tigger Martin, Main Road. Tarp Office, Belmont. Mirage Westside Supermarket. Arima. Anderson Fashion, opposite Citygate. Western Union, Tuna Puna, and all participating bands. Presented by Super Pan Man, Dane Gulston and Friends.
Supported by CCNTV 6, The Express Newspaper, and I-95.5 FM.
For more info, call 732-3402.
Get ready for the biggest business-to-business event of the year, the Trade and Investment Convention, TIC, happening July 9th to 11th at the Center of Excellence, Macoya. Doors open 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. on business days, July 9th and 10th, and 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. on Consumer Day, Saturday, July 11th. A business dress code is in effect on business days. Park and ride services will be available from Constantine Park and the UETGR North Car Park on all 3 days, with additional service from NAM DevCo on July 9th and 11th. Register online at www.ttma.com/tick and attend free. The deadline for free registration is Wednesday, July 8th. After that, admission is $50 at the door. The Trade and Investment Convention is proudly sponsored by the Ministry of Trade, Investment and Tourism, Exim Bank, Ballroops Group, and Robust Security Network Limited. Don't miss Trinidad and Tobago's premier business networking and investment event. We look forward to seeing you at TIC.
Something very important, there is an intrinsic neurotrophic factor that is released through myokines, that is some peptides that we have in our muscle that produce neuromodulation and increase that peptide in the brain to increase the neurocognitive of the brain.
I'm glad you said that, right. So exercise has an important part to play in the aging brain. As we get older, our gray matter does shrink, we have reduction of synapses, but exercise is shown to actually improve our cognitive functioning.
Totally.
Maybe he landed here totally by coincidence. But if by chance he's admiring your fresh coat of Benjamin Moore soft sky blue, well, that's a pretty high compliment. Coming from an expert.
Take some time for yourself or spend some time with the family at Sandy Point Village Hotel. Enjoy our various studio and suite apartments, self-contained with their own kitchenettes and Wi-Fi. We also have our famous 100-foot swimming pool and our beachfront restaurant, the Steak and Lobster Grill. And our location in Crown Point puts us near the center of activity from the nylon pool to the local nightlife. Call us and make your reservations at 639-8533, 389-2378 or email us at sandypointvillagehotel@gmail.com.
I'm back here talking about the WESN, and I was speaking about the perception people might have of the state coming after you, of government persecution, of political persecution. But, of course, it's more pronounced when a political party is in government as opposed to being in opposition. Now, I mean, you can very, very loosely lump in the UNC dissidents, and that happened while in opposition. You can potentially lump that in, but I would argue that while it's similar, it might not quite be the same. Because on some level, I don't actually really know if what the conflict between the two sides were really about. It seemed more as though one side had concerns, the other side did not like that such things were brought up in the public, and then things came to a head. It also seems as though the concerns were not necessarily the best fleshed out. In many ways, were they trying to hedge their bets? And some of the subsequent actions by some of the individuals that were involved in the matter made me come to question the validity of their previous actions and decisions. Because in part, I just felt as though if you were genuine, truly, at least, especially in one case, you spent so many times in Parliament speaking against your political opponent only to join them at the last moment because you're pushed out of your previous party. But that could, in part, be an example of the brutal reality of our politics. A brutal lack of fairness, a brutal lack of consideration for anything outside of political loyalty. Now the question is, perhaps political loyalty at times by politicians is viewed too much as a reasonable measuring stick for how society should function. Now, one of the reports this morning, I believe it's in today's papers, is Dr. Heath Rowley saying that he received threats from certain officials of states. Now, it's interesting that he used the word threats, right? This is a quote, I've been getting threats from certain officials of state that I am next and Balize House is next, right? It's interesting that he uses the word threats. Now, to what extent is it a threat like, say, what the government is trying to say they are threats against the state? I'm not sure. Because I don't know who said he's next and Balize House is next. I don't know by what definition, the context are they saying. Is it you are next to suffer legal consequences that are brought about in good faith? Is it you are next to be hit with a PDOs where you will suffer consequences that are technically legal? We don't necessarily have the capacity to charge you with anything, but we're going to still run you through the system. Those are two different things. And then you could go a step further. And we won't go there. Now, one of the quotes he gave to the press is, the government has declared war on the people of Trinidad and Tobago, largely on the basis of who they perceive them to be supporters of politically. And if this country doesn't believe me, those who are feeling depression now, my advice to you is bang your belly, there's more to come. He said the administration was operating on the premise that, quote, if you prospered under the PNM, you must be destroyed, end quote. Well, the thing is, what that quote is not necessarily saying, and I believe this to be true in at least one anecdotal story that I was told, is it's not if you prospered because of the PNM. Right? I don't know what Dr. Rowley intended to say, but I will add this context based on one situation that I was told about. It's not if you prospered because of the PNM, from the PNM, but rather if you prospered while the PNM was there. You engage the state, you ask for no favors, you get no handouts, you have no sweetheart deal. You just, I'm a vendor, I'm providing XYZ, or I have this business idea, maybe I want this piece of land, I want to buy it, I want to engage with this public entity as a service provider, whatever. And you look as though you have prospered because your venture was successful. A venture predicated on merit and hard work and trying to provide a service to meet a need. Not a political favor and a friend and who get what contract at inflated rates and then give a kickback. We're not talking that. And I guess maybe that's why Dr. Rowley phrased it the way he did. Not if you prospered because of the PNM, if you prospered under, while the PNM was in office. So on some level, I'm not saying that the statement is a universal truth. But what I am saying is I understand if people think that based on an anecdotal situation or two or three that they might know of. Now, is that enough to say that this is a universal policy of the UNC? Technically, no, right? That could be similar to how the protesters are at the mercy of whichever senior police officers at the scene. Any sort of venture is at the mercy not just from the government, but also what other aspect of the public sector they engage with. And every now and then you have overzealous people that either decide, well, I need to persecute you because that's the expectations that we believe is hanging over our heads. That's the expectations of our society. You came in under the PNM, so you have to be a PNM, so we have to get rid of you somehow, persecute you, limit you, contain you, whatever. And it doesn't have to come from a politician. It could come from a brown noser. The thing is, Dr. is probably saying these things some people might basically look at he's slightly hypocritical or very hypocritical. It depends on how much you perceived his stances to be threatening, and a lot of it is how objective or not you're going to be. The reason why I say slightly hypocritical is, let's not forget, yes, I don't know if he blocked any reporters from being in press conferences, but it wasn't as though he stopped when he started to dislike the questions. More importantly, there were, I guess in hindsight now we could say this, right? You never know what the potential is, or rather if potential will be realized until after the fact. There were limits to what the previous government did on this front. They had their ways. There are stories about certain things. There are stories about certain things done to certain people or not allowed with certain people and who might have been blacklisted or what have you, right? A lot of that seemingly had to do with, I can't speak for traditional UNC people, a lot of that had to do with people on the outside of the party who used to be in good standing with the party. And I'll leave that there. The report says that Dr. Rowley accused the Kamala Persad government of targeting people based on perceived political affiliations, saying citizens were becoming fearful. That last part, I think there's another part where I felt as though Dr. Rowley has to be careful if he doesn't understand. At the time, people had certain fears under his administration, and to say that citizens are now becoming fearful as though they were never fearful before, that I don't think is true. However, I'm willing to concede the point where I think the scale, the level, the severity is a little bit different this time. Now, on some level, if we go by the UNC's commentary, everything the PNM did was wicked and evil. Now the question is, do we apply those same standards to themselves while in government? And there's still a part of me that doesn't necessarily like to use absolute language like that, but the situation with the Hadids has taken an interesting turn, and one could perceive the nature of what they're being investigated for, at least the initial reports. That in and of itself was an interesting plot twist. Because now there is the discussion over the state land which was granted to someone else on a lease, and then I believe the lease was bought by Mr. Hadid, and it's been an ongoing thing ever since, whether a relationship or something that has been negotiated and contested. Now, on some level, I understand where the government is coming from. The only thing is, can they say with a lie detector test that they themselves have not done any of the behavior that they're accusing the past PNM administration under Stuart Young, technically, of doing with regards to trying to fast track whatever paperwork for this lease in the last minute, which obviously looks very bad. The thing is, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, is it because government bureaucracy is just moving too slow? That they were now like, oh, we need to get this done because we know that they're going to try and steal it from him. Because the reason why I could say that is this is not something where he now looked to lease out the land. They now put an agreement from scratch in place. This has been an issue from before. One article in today's paper references the current president of the Senate. At the time, I think he might have been Senator Wade Mark, with regards to whatever the discussion was years ago. So it's not as though this came out of nowhere. So I'll let that whole thing about what's proper, improper over this lease, that's a separate conversation. I'm not saying the lease is correct or not correct. What I am saying is usually when we hear about last minute paperwork to try and push something through, it's because, well, they're trying to manufacture something on a thin air, like with, I believe it was the CPEP manager's contracts. You know, we just create a set of contracts and inflate the system. No, this was something that's been ongoing for quite some time. But more importantly, it seems rather convenient. When you look at what the Hadids are saying, it's hard not to have the questions. Their claims are not proven, but it's hard not to have the questions. So, according to the Hadids, I believe, this whole thing kicked off when they made certain complaints. Now, the complaints that they made, it's not like they had specific whistleblower statements that really put the government in bad light, right? But they spoke out against certain things. They also got a legal team to defend the leases. Now, to what extent did one or the other contribute to this whole drama? We don't know for sure, at least not right now. But they are saying that 2 days before police officers came to arrest him, they sent a detailed pre-action protocol letter to the Attorney General. The thing is, there are some people who look at the reasons why the Hadids were arrested and find it difficult to believe. Because when they were detained, the thought was some kind of corruption case, corruption scandal, maybe involved in certain aspects of criminality, but to say, oh, a threat against the government, a threat against the Prime Minister's life, and then you see who they detained. And obviously none of them are going to be trigger puller, so it's like, there has to be somebody else that you're not detaining. Where's the intelligence? And the whole situation seems very incredulous. And it just lines up very convenient that all of a sudden now, the people involved in a dispute with the lease of state lands have a conspiracy to commit murder accusation, not a charge. At least as far as I'm aware, they haven't charged them yet. Accusation hanging over their heads. It seems rather convenient. And here's the thing. When we saw things of convenience under the PNM, what did Talking Point do? Can't speak for anybody else. Talking Point called them out. Now, a lot of the other commentators who called out the PNM, some of them, all of a sudden, they're on state media. They couldn't get on state media when the PNM was in power. Now, all of a sudden, they're on state media and monopolizing state media, apparently. But no, we are consistent. We don't like conveniences. Now, things that seem too convenient doesn't mean that it can't be true. But let me go a step further. One of the interesting things was when the PNM was in power, there were concerns by people who, look, I was a critic of the government. So obviously, there had people in my circle who were concerned about how far I criticize the government. Am I going too far? You know, is there going to be any blowback because of it? Now, little old me, it has shown for the most part to not be so. Technically speaking, I am an acknowledged member of the media by the PNM, and I was so at the height of me criticizing them for whatever, whenever, wherever, right? I was never turned away from whatever it was that they had for the media, or, well, like opposition press conferences now, and it's not as though I have been treating them with kids' gloves once they lost the election and been in opposition. Sorry, Mr. Dabney. So, people had concerns under the PNM. You know, it was reporters, commenters, you know, third-party people. And to some extent, businessmen. We've heard rumors with regards to corporate interests, right? So you have this perception. And perhaps the PNM knew that, all right, look, we're not trying to persecute anybody with government power and authority. Maybe let's not initiate emergency powers for something like crime. Because they were reluctant to do so. I think it was basically a year before they declared the first state of emergency on December the 30th. Then opposition leader Kamala Prasad-Biswas, she kept saying, you know, declare state of emergency, declare state of emergency. And they were reluctant to do so. And they were I guess you could say, cognizant of the fact that, look, a state of emergency is not necessarily the best tool to deal with everyday crime and everyday violence. It's an emergency option. It's in the name. But I do wonder if they were also quite aware of, we get emergency powers. That's going to, if certain things happen while we have emergency powers, that's going to cause people to look at us funny. So now we have this current government where it seems as though, and I've said this before, they might be a victim of, in a way, it's kind of like Dutch disease. Dutch disease is, of course, you're making so much money off of oil and gas, you decide to abandon other sectors of the economy because oil and gas is so much more profitable, so much more efficient. It's so much better bang for your buck, right? However, in this case, state of emergency, it's easier. It's easier. Look how easy it is to solve these problems. Look how easy it is to suppress the murder rate. Look how easy it is to go after the gang leaders, even though some of the people under PDOs technically were already in remand, right, at the maximum security prison. But look how easy it is. And then maybe all of a sudden, you fall for the temptation of that phenomenon where every problem, if all you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. It's a screw. No, it's not. It's a nail. And then you just get to hammering everything because that's all you got. That's all you know now. You don't know life without a state of emergency anymore. You don't know how to operate in that space. This current commissioner of police, technically, for the most part, has not really been a commissioner of police without a state of emergency. Leading up to his candidacy as commissioner of police, we were under state of emergency. And the times in between, one could argue, carnival and an election, even if it wasn't technically a state of emergency, there was a heightened sense of police presence. And it was a time when, you know, certain things weren't just naturally suppressed by the national environment and how we operate during those time periods. So, it seems as though now every problem is going to be solved with a preventative detention order. Because the use of it is so expansive. And the problem for the government is you might be doing everything in good faith. You might be well-intentioned with all of these decisions. You might have valid reasons to do so, but you have allowed yourself to set yourself up to be viewed as acting in bad faith. Because at times things seem too convenient, and because at times the use of emergency powers naturally takes away from accountability and transparency, because all of a sudden you don't have to meet certain standards of evidence before you can act. You just do it, and you don't have to be accountable for as much as you would have because of the standards being less. You're not as accountable with regards to certain decisions. So we are left more in the dark. And we've already seen, this is the thing, and again, apologies, Mr. Dabney, we've already seen what happened under the previous administration. When you leave people with less information, not enough information, no information, what will people do? They will start to speculate. And then it doesn't take much for their perception. You could say their perception is biased, or you could say their suspicions are aroused, right? Technically, those imply two different things, but they ultimately come to the same point, and that being, now you are perceived as potentially doing something wrong. And it's similar to what I said previously during the PNM administration with conflict of interest. Even the perception of one can be damaging to your intent or your agenda, whichever one it is, right? To your intention. And the inability to fully grasp how public opinion works, but not just fully grasp it. This is the best part, because at least with the PNM, you did see a push and pull. It wasn't that they were totally blissfully unaware of how the public operated, but rather there were specific instances where perhaps they had unique aspects to them and they misread the situation and ran headfirst into a wall. But the current government had the opportunity. They were there. They were front and center for everything that the PNM might have done wrong. Every mistake in communication the PNM might have made. They were there because they commented on most, if not all of it. They were there to see what didn't work. And for the life of me, I don't understand why it is they're doubling down on some of the very same processes and tactics and means that they criticized. Messaging that they criticized, that they identified as being wrong, that they themselves stirred the pot. It's almost as though the government thinks, well, we're not there to stir the pot, therefore no one is going to have a negative opinion of this scheme. But when the PNM did it, we were there to stir the pot. We were there to point out or to make the accusations. But there's no one left to do that effectively, so we're fine. And I don't understand, because ultimately, it didn't come from you. A lot of the criticisms on the PNM that stuck to the PNM didn't come from the opposition. I know UNC supporters might not want to believe that, but a lot of criticism that stuck to the PNM that led to that election defeat came from the people. To some extent, it came from the media. To some extent, it came from commentators and opinion columnists and the like, people like myself, but a lot of it came from the people. Because they didn't really talk about it. They didn't really talk about it. They just voted. They just kept their opinions, a lot of them, to themselves in any professional capacity at least, and then they voted the way that they voted. So, I don't understand, and I think I will never understand, and maybe it's because it's plainly obvious, I'm not like them. So there's going to be blind spots with regards to exactly why some politicians do what they do. And with regards to the current government, I will never understand why they have decided to repeat, compound, and go further than the mistakes made by the PNM. Because with the PNM, I could understand in certain situations where, well, they didn't realize the public will perceive things the way that they did. And then they had to do damage control. And then they move on to another unique situation, and then there are unique challenges there. I could get that. But some of these things, it's not just that they should have known better because they should have seen the pitfalls that the PNM fell into. They themselves repeatedly fall for pitfalls that they set for themselves. And that's, I think, part of the reason why people are willing to speculate and assume that a lot of what the government is doing is intentional. Not out of some measure of, well, we don't understand, we're doing our best. But rather, no, we have an agenda and it's intentional. And then you get to what you see there at the bottom, persecution by the government. And then now, because think about it, the ordinary folks, middle and lower class, especially lower middle and under, love to blame the 1%. They'll blame the government and the 1% for all their troubles. They'll distrust the 1% and at times the government, right? Because a lot of them experience what is either perceived or real injustice in our society, in our economy. And of course, the rich always seemingly get ahead and are untouched, and that's not fair. So we distrust them, we dislike them. We want to blame certain things, sometimes with good reason, on them. They're not going to be popular. They'll be popular within their own circles. But they're not going to be popular necessarily on the national stage. Those that do a lot of charity and show a lot of empathy for people at the lower rung of the economic spectrum and do a lot of work and have a good amount of awareness of what's going on with regards to people on the ground. Those that have shown that they're not just sitting in an ivory tower enjoying disinfected, sanitized life, a quarantined existence. Those that have shown that that's not how they operate, yeah, the society might respect them, but a lot of the 1% are perceived to be people that they live in a different Trinidad and Tobago than the rest of us, right? They go to places that are too expensive for the rest of us to go to. And that insulates them from having to socialize and mix with the rest of us. So it's easy to dislike them. And yet, here comes a government that now, and you could say maybe there's an agenda with the media, whatever. But I do think that a lot of the wind in the government sails of potentially going after what might be white-collar crime, because that's the thing. The government said we're going after white-collar crime. So when you pick up Mr. Adid, you're thinking, all right, some kind of white-collar crime, we're going after them. No, it's a threat against the government. Well, in part, it's because people now think you hit us a 649, but also in part, we've heard this story before. How many threats against the government are there going to be? Are they going to have? And here's the thing, let's assume that they're all genuine. What are you doing wrong to be this hated as a government? Of course, there's the whole thing about, is Mr. Hadid connected to the PNM, is he not, blah, 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 blah. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. On some level, there are certain aspects of this case which are pertinent, but I can't even reach to because my concerns are a bit more basic than that. It's how we have allowed things to devolve. And the thing is, it doesn't have to be that the country is actually in a worse state. We perceive things to be worse, and that is affecting people's behavior. That's affecting people's trust. That's affecting the economy. That's affecting people's engagement with government services. That's affecting a lot of things. That will eventually affect how we interact with each other. That will potentially add fuel to the fire of divisiveness. Because I get it, people love to hear the opposition's complaints or PNM complaints and say, well, when you were in office this and when you were in office that. And look, I bring up the past as well. But at some point, you can bring up the past and still consider what's being said. Still evaluate it. Not just say, well, because this person said it, it has to be untrue. Because we don't trust them. Well, if they're saying something that is in line with things you observe elsewhere, are you still going to hold yourself to that. And this is the problem now we've run into. I think it has crystallized, it has formally reared its ugly head. It's no longer theoretical. This is one of the problems of relying on emergency powers. Emergency powers bypasses rights and protections. It suspends them. It makes certain things no longer exist for all intents and purposes. Things that in normal times are not just important, they are necessary. But the question, of course, is, as I mentioned before, who's going to be the next conspiracy to murder the Prime Minister, to justify the next state of emergency? Because it's not as though they're saying, well, the Hadids, they were the threat all along. And as was brought up, I don't know if I brought it up on the show, but there was intelligence on other threats against the government. Why were there no other suspects detained under PDOs for other threats against the government? The first state of emergency, the commissioner pronounced, the intelligence says this, the intelligence says that. It's very interesting that you're operating on intelligence, not evidence, right? So is it that you had intelligence that there was a threat, but you didn't have enough intelligence to know who it was back then? You were just operating under suspicion? We started a state of emergency because you had threats made by persons who you don't know. So you can't potentially even verify if the threats were real or not. That is the implication of having two similar situations but treating it differently. Oh, the threats against the government. Oh my gosh, a suspicious car showed up to intimidate Minister Sturge and we had to race him to a police station to protect him. Not, well, we arrested them and held them under PDOs. No, that didn't happen. I wonder why. And what did I say with regards to commentators before the break? How do you tell the genuine ones to the ones with agenda when they're not consistent? When their positions aren't consistent? When their stances aren't consistent? When their principles are those of convenience, but not rooted in any sort of morals that they apply fairly, evenly, consistently. You don't pick and choose when a principle suits you. Because we've had multiple threats against the government, but this, as far as we're aware, is the first PDO. Now, they've had other PDOs. They've had other PDOs. But I don't believe we've gotten PDOs for people threatening government. We've gotten it reported. So why report on it now in this manner? I mean, one could say that the story was leaked. Why was it leaked? The story with Erla was also leaked. And the lack of explanation just adds fuel to the fire of the perception. And the whole situation is now one where I will argue it's compounding itself. And again, there was concerns about what a state of emergency could mean, the dangers or the risks of a state of emergency. And we just assumed, well, look, we've had them in the past, it's been okay, it should be okay now. And for whatever reason, the current administration does a lot of looking at a situation, looking at the precedent set, and basically saying, hold my bear, I know how to escalate things further, to go beyond the point that you assumed we would limit ourselves to going. One person makes unsolicited statements about attacking the Prime Minister. She gets held for a few days and then released. One father, he has a moment where he is displaying his grief on live radio. he gets PDO'd. And I think what's going to happen is, this is my suspicion, some of the local judges, they're going to be put between a rock and a hard place. Because some of the challenges that the Hadids are bringing up could have far-reaching consequences for the utilization of preventative detention orders moving forward. Could have far-reaching consequences for the implementation of state of emergencies moving forward, including whenever a decision is given on whatever matter or whatever aspect of the case that the judge is ruling on, including from that moment on, not just in some distant future with some distant states of emergencies. And now, judges have to weigh the needs of the individual case, so the implications on the wider framework of our legal system. And I guess I'm not saying if there's an agenda, what they're going to do. I'm just saying it's not that simple to say, ooh, injustice, rule against it. Because there can be practical implications that you just don't know. The flip side is, one could say, listen, if we build a society on sacrificing people at the altar for the sake of general public safety, we run the risk of literally throwing away all of our ethics and morals. We just don't know that we've thrown it all away. If we take the easy way out, we run the risk of essentially compromising ourselves ethically and setting ourselves up for a future where we will descend further and further into an immoral mess. Not just informal immorality, who like to speed, who like to drink and drive, who like to do all kind of whatlessness, right? Who like to do drugs, whatever. But rather a form of systemic, formalized, legalized, unethical behavior. That's potentially what's at stake if the judges get it wrong. It will inform our future generations of who we are as a people, for better or worse. And the for worse is not as difficult as you would think to fall into. One of the things that I do wonder whenever politicians bring up legacy, first of all, even Mr. Pandya and Mr. Manning's legacy, I would argue, were compromised. But what compromised them was different to what's compromising the last administration's legacies now. Because at the end of the day, on some level, we look at the waterfront at Mr. Manning and all of the government buildings that was built under his time, and there's a certain level of appreciation for that part of his administration. There are other things that he did. In hindsight, maybe it's the benefit of hindsight, or maybe he should have known better up front. We do ask, well, why did you do some of these things? We wish you didn't. We could say that at the very least in hindsight. It's 2020, but we could say it nevertheless. We wish that certain things did not happen. Same thing with Mr. Pandya. But this is different. One of the things is Dr. Keith Rowley could have had a legacy if he met the needs of the moment and kind of understood the context by which what the job was asking of him from, say, 2019 to when it was over in 2025, early 2025. And I almost feel as though destiny said, look, here's a path, and he was like, no, I want to go this way. And instead of meeting the needs of the moment, the challenges that life was throwing at us, he kind of met some of them, but then was too busy doing something else. And on some level, it's not necessarily going to be the worst legacy a politician has ever had, but I do think there are missed opportunities, if that's what concerns you, how you're going to be remembered. And by missed opportunities, I don't mean missed opportunities to pull the wool over people's eyes and tell them a false narrative. Missed opportunities to show something for history, something that is respectable and enduring. But it is what it is. And the thing is, what we see with the current administration, this is the problem now. The more successful it is, you need to understand something. I am seeing a lot of negative with the current administration and also with the way that the police service is managed. The more that it is tolerated, the more that it is allowed to persist, the more that it can get away with, the more that it accomplishes under these conditions with these means, utilizing these tools that on some level I either speculate or outright perceive to be as unethical. The more this technically succeeds, the more it informs whoever comes next, whether it is another UNC government or PNM government or somebody else, anybody else, it doesn't matter who it is, that next administration is going to do more. Because that's what happens with corruption. The more one government was able to get away with things, the new government says, hold my beer, I'm going to profit more from this. Because that's human nature. Give an inch, take a mile. You tell a child something, they're going to push the boundaries. Why do we assume that once we all reach 18, we are all magically adults? I have interacted with people north of 60 who have temper tantrums like 4-year-olds. You know this to be true yourselves. So like young children, older children, 60-year-old children, 80-year-old children, age does not automatically bring maturity. It only provides us with experience. We learn from the experience by how we digest it, by how we internalize it. We learn from experience what we decide to take from it. It doesn't just automatically impart wisdom into our brain. Many people learn the wrong lessons. So, with regards to the future, we run the risk, because some people might say, it's fine, I trust the current administration to do the right thing when, at the end of the day, so I'm going to tolerate some excess now because maybe we need it. Maybe crime is that bad, we need it. The problem is, it's not going to end there. It never ends at the point where you think you're comfortable. And that assumes you have an accurate read. That assumes that you're correct, that it's fine once it doesn't go past whatever point you think is the point of no return, that you have in the back of your mind that they haven't reached yet. And the government might never reach that point. So you might be comfortable for the entire time. But it's not just about what they are doing and will do, but what the people will do after them. Because you give this government an inch, even if they only take a foot, the next government, even if it's the same party, different party, they'll take the mile. Because let's just say the current government does something excessive and gets itself voted out. In theory, you would think, right, the new government will learn from the mistakes of the party voted out and will know better. That's essentially the assumption that we make and why we operate in such a limited manner with regards to our democracy. We assume that when we vote somebody out, we're sending a message to all politicians, this is unacceptable, don't do it. I just said again, not for the first time by the way, I just said, I don't understand why the current administration loves repeating the mistakes of the previous administration, especially when they were front row center to watch Rome burn. Well, now Rome isn't burning. Now, we are basically 2 stages from pure ash and the earth swallowing us up in a seismic event. how we engage in our democracy implies that we believe, otherwise it makes absolutely no sense, right? We believe that when we vote someone out and vote someone else in, things will be better. We will get change. Yeah, we get change, not necessarily for the better. Not always, anyway. But forget about the policy decisions, the budgetary decisions. I mean, I think it's in the papers today, $800 million US loan. I remember when a UNC opposition complained about a PNM government having to finance their budgets taking out foreign debt. I remember that day. Does anybody else remember that? I remember that. I agreed with it at the time. Now, you will see the commentators who are acting in bad faith, who have an agenda, will be the ones that all of a sudden, no, it's fine, it's fine. You know, when the PNM took out foreign debt, it was bad. But when the UNC takes out foreign debt, it's good. It's a good thing. It's a good thing that our growth is shrinking. Our growth is less than on the PNM. That's the only things I haven't technically said yet. I remarked on how bad our growth was, but technically it was more under the PNM. Now, that could be a correlation, or there could be some significant causation behind it. But I'm just saying, I have to be consistent. What was important to criticize in the PNM is still important. So, the next election, as I said, we assume that it's going to send a message. Didn't seem to send the right message this time. So the next election, what's probably going to happen is, depending on how bad things get, the UNC will lose some votes. The PNM will regain votes. It might not be enough for them to win, right? It might not be that bad. But regardless, the change in voter patterns, we assume is going to send a message. That message is going to fall on deaf ears. It's going to fall on deaf ears. And then we will see how much further things can go, how much worse things could get. What next plant is going to shut down? What next factory is going to shut down? What next private business is going to say, we no longer want to operate in Trinidad and Tobago? And then what other private business we're going to see all of a sudden, the government is going to say, well, we have this thing with their ties to the PNM, and, you know, they threaten so-and-so in the government, and, you know, listen, I know it seems convenient, but hear me out, you know? They just happened to have an investigation against them with regards to this lease. And then they also just had a conspiracy to commit murder. You know, as what is normally done by the business community every year. This is a common practice. Nothing to see here. Nothing special about this. Nothing unusual about this. Move along, move along. I mean, case in point, if you don't believe me, look at the flip side. There were too many people in the opposition who were still acting like they did not process the election results properly. And you might say, oh, well, only the PNM will do it, the UNC won't do it. Again, I'm saying, you appoint your own commissioner. Things are not going as swimmingly as you might think. And for the life of me, I cannot get over how many times I keep witnessing the AG says something that is either contradicted by or contradicts something already said by the Minister of Defense or the Minister of Homeland Security. And they go along and around in a vicious cycle of having messages crafted sloppily enough that they technically contradict each other. Because the needs of the moment says, I have to say this, but we never thought about long term. We look like idiots. And the thing is, all right, they're not dumb, they're smart. That potentially means that it's intentional. That potentially means that the inability to be consistent on your messaging because it's not actually based on principles is intentional. That's what that implies. That they actually want it so. So they're just finding excuses to cover up or to justify their intentions. Because they want to grandstand, and look, the previous government on some levels did things similar, right? Maybe not on national security because Mr. Hines at the very least knew to be silent. But they grandstand about how they're going to go after the 1%. And then when somebody from the 1% is arrested, oh, no government minister could authorize or instruct for a PDO or whatever. I mean, do you count the Prime Minister as a government minister? I know somebody speculated on that. I mean, that's more of a silly example than a serious one, but still. And I think the Samru shooting has shown that the public has brought up certain aspects from that video that I didn't necessarily bring up. Or at least if I did it very minimally. They brought up certain aspects with regards to concerns stemming from the video, with each of them who called in with those concerns utilizing unique language. Now, one of the tells that something is, in a way, being viral and spreading, and the commentary is not necessarily unique to each individual, but rather it's being spread amongst, one narrative is being spread amongst people. So yes, they may agree with it or not, but it's not as though it came organically, uniquely from each of them. Rather, one person heard the next person, so they repeated what was said, and then the next one repeats what's said, because they use the same terms. Because it's not just the same story, but the narrative is the same. The terminology is the same. The framework is the same. The phrasing is the same. You know, and at times you see this with news when you analyze it for certain stories, even the cadence is the same. And then you question, well, is this really your opinion on the matter, or are you just recycling someone else's opinion and it's going down the line? But with regards to certain aspects of the Samru shooting, one of the things that I remarked is different individual callers had different phrases, had different cadences, struggled to describe what it was they were seeing because it was almost as though they instinctively kind of knew something's off, so they came up with their own angle of how to try to describe it. They selected their own unique words with regards to how to try to explain it. And it implies that they didn't hear what the other caller said, and they just wanted to rinse and repeat that. No. They all came to a similar conclusion where they felt uneasy. They couldn't even necessarily say what proper police procedure was, what the proper thing is supposed to be, how actual gunfight. No, they just knew, listen, it's not looking right. It's looking too extreme. Some people said extreme, some people said expressive, excessive, etc., etc. They all kind of came to the same place to some degree based off of instincts. And I bring that up to say, with regards to things like this, that's what's happening. It's not as though there's one situation where someone believes they were persecuted and that's what's being spread around the horn, and it's just being rinsed and repeated around the table, right? You know, I'm in school, one of the things that always bothered me in school, particularly in things like religion class, is when the teacher asked people to speak about whatever the topic was, to share something on the topic. Everyone kind of just parrots the opinions of the last person. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to say. And in a class of like 40, you'll get like 5 unique opinions. And 90% says one opinion. Because that's the safe one. That's the one that technically the teacher was trying to teach us in the session. So we just kind of give a generic answer along those lines. And that always bothered me. That always bothered me. But I think in this case, when you talk about persecution, what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of different people having different anecdotal examples, and in many cases, probably more than one, that they could point to, that they are suspicious of, that they have questions left unanswered. And they're saying, hold up, this doesn't feel right. And it's not the case where you have one situation that doesn't feel right and that's being spread. Because statistically speaking, that could be irrelevant. And that could mean nothing. But when you have multiple instances of people feeling a certain way, being concerned in a certain way, and just because a minority of them are PNM doesn't somehow disprove the whole thing. And that is what the government now has to deal with, in part because it is of their own making. It is of their own making because there are those people who are going to look at the Samru situation, the Joshua Samru and Kaya Sealy situation, Christopher Samru situation, the Alyssa Phillips situation, and that's technically just one news story that's been ongoing for months. That doesn't include all the other things that's been happening, like the MILAT situation, like how the government handles government programs, not just MILAT, CPEP, URP. What's going on with the promises for jobs? They promised a lot of jobs, right? They promised all the jobs in the world. Where are the jobs? They promised houses. They promised 500 houses a week. They will build 500 houses a week. Then came the bait and switch. Well, I mean, did they promise low-income housing, 500 low-income houses a week, or 500 houses? Because they had a for-profit project that then, if I am not mistaken, that is the same project. All of a sudden, you know, reports come out that there might be some funny business going on, so HGC pulls the plug on a $3.4 billion project. Or maybe the government was like, well, if we pull the plug on the project, we'll have $3.4 billion to reallocate. I don't know. But where are the houses that were promised? I mean, right now, so the Minister of Public Utilities is trying to refute claims from the opposition leader about prolonged water shortages in several communities, right? Part of it, of course, is people assumed or suspected this was true under the PNM, right? That UNC local government corporations were being mistreated. We're not getting their full budget allocation. Now, that was apparently true, right? I believe the UNC councillors have told me that with regards to their and other corporations. But one of the things that I always caution was, don't just assume that it's only UNC corporations being shortchanged. PNM corporations probably were being shortchanged too. That's why they also can fix the potholes. That's why they also can have any sort of projects. That's why they also had issues with other issues with maintenance. Right? But the thing is, look, now there's a situation where the hotels in Tobago feel mistreated by WASA. I'll just put that out there. Now, who's going to maybe speculate that there's some sort of political agenda with that? Whether it is to nickel and dime, or maybe it's a water racket. And after Minister Padrat said, we're going to go after water rackets, well, please tell me, how is it that the price difference between getting water from a WASA pipe as compared to getting water from a WASA truck, because your pipe-borne services failed, no fault of the consumer, how is the price difference something like 100 to 200% more? The same water that I'm paying for at a certain rate just to get through a pipe, because your system failed, I have to pay an exponentially higher price. That seem fair to you? And then when you have situations that doesn't seem fair, now all of a sudden, at the very least, You could speculate on the inability of a government to operate fairly. Therefore, if that is true, persecution is not that far behind if it isn't already upon us. And again, these are the things that the government now has to deal with. Because while there have been situations where I have speculated, it hasn't been confirmed or reported on, that there might have been better accountability. So that's how we got the Coast Guard to intercept the boat with the kidnapped lady. That's how we got the police to respond to certain situations in a timely manner. But the flip side is, I could speculate on that. It wasn't necessarily reported. I could speculate on that. But then I could also point to social media posts that came up on my feed last night where people are talking about violent incidents outside the house and the police basically saying, well, we'll come in the morning. Where's the accountability there? And all of these things are going to feed into a narrative that is left to grow because the government doesn't want to engage in proactive, good faith communication and leadership. Now, maybe we will fall far enough down that at some point, politicians are going to say, well, whatever they did, we just can't do. But I'm not going to take that for granted because that hasn't worked out for us so much. One could argue whatever corruption you think existed in the past, it has only grown from there. If you think it was not a lot of corruption, well, it's a lot of corruption now, potentially. If you think there was a lot of corruption then, I would argue there's more corruption now. One of the callers from Chaguanas always speaks about what the public service was like before. And you swear he's speaking about two different countries when you compare that to what things seemingly, how they seem to operate now in the last 4 years, 5 years. So, it's a lot. It's a lot because I said the judges would be in a rock and a hard place. To be fair, the citizenry is as well. You don't want to necessarily speculate and go off half-baked on things like this. You know, you don't want to be part of a situation that turns into a cry wolf situation. But the flip side is, when is it appropriate to have concerns? You know, how long do you wait before you have concerns? How far do you let things go before you have concerns? Because potentially there's a part where your concerns, if you have them early enough, even if they are technically inaccurate, they can prevent actual bad things from happening. Because maybe things aren't that bad. Maybe a lot of it is just poor leadership and poor communication, and things are not as bad as they are perceived to be. But you still potentially go through the exercise of calling it out, demanding more accountability and transparency, not because the situation is bad, but because you don't want it to get there. You don't want it to actually go further and reach a point where it is undeniable. Because once it gets undeniable, once things are devolved to the point where it is self-evident, where only the most unobjective observer is going to disagree. The problem is if you wait for it to get to that point, then we're not trying to prevent illness, we're trying to deal with the consequences of having poor health practices. And one of the things I learned from COVID was you don't really ever recover back to full health. In a lot of cases, where things go too far, now you're just trying to minimize the damage. And you potentially could have lived a longer life if you prevented these things from happening in the first place, but by failing to do so, you have potentially shortened your lifespan. You have potentially harmed your overall quality of life. You potentially will run the risk of having certain symptoms stay with you, certain conditions stay with you. Look, heat stroke. Apparently, if you suffer heat stroke in the military, certain jobs you no longer are able to qualify for. Because there's something about heat stroke that has a lasting effect on the body. So certain high-end positions you can't necessarily get. Certain high-demand, physically tough jobs you can't necessarily apply for. It's not easy to fix things that get too far, that get too bad. I mean, you could look at El Salvador, and some people have, and some people say, why can't we have that here? Why can't we be like, what, Singapore? Yeah, but those things, they have strict regulations, man. They take things serious. We are not a serious nation. We prefer not to be, but perhaps we're being forced to grow up, to learn how to be more serious, to be more harsh with ourselves. Perhaps that's we will be forced to go that way. And then perhaps the old-time days and the old-time ways that we miss, that we lament are long gone, won't be about how nice people used to be, but how we took our easy-going nature for granted. We abused it ourselves. And then, by doing so, we end up in this situation where we are forced to make changes within ourselves that might seem to be drastic in contrast to our nature, drastic against our nature. Rather than trying to find that happy medium of how to be easygoing but still be responsible. No, we'll have to figure out, ironically, the equivalent of MyLat, but for a whole society. All right, I mean, I don't know if anyone wants to call in. I've been on this topic for quite some time. Like I said, no Ashraf today. He has professional responsibilities, being an expert in his field. I did not hear from Karen herself, but I have been told she's okay. I'm not entirely sure if one of the media reports is accurate, but I don't necessarily want to get into some kind of quasi-debate in such a position. Hopefully, you know, whenever she's willing to come on Talking Points and if she's willing to then speak on this situation, you know, then we will find out. Otherwise, you know, we have to respect her privacy. She's not the Prime Minister. So, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? One of the last things I'll bring up with whatever time we have left is the situation with CARICOM. I find this interesting. And again, there were those that wanted to praise the Prime Minister. But ironically, Dr. Heath Rowley says it best. He says that well, this is the report, how it's phrased in the report. He dismissed suggestions that the Prime Minister secured a diplomatic victory, saying with regards to CARICOM, saying instead that regional leaders bailed out Trinidad and Tobago from itself after describing what was an unnecessary foreign policy dispute. It was a totally unnecessary, unforced error by Trinidad and Tobago in the way it went about, in a confrontational way, to treat an issue which other people would have dealt with differently. Now, to be fair, one would imagine Dr. Rowley and Dr. Emery Brown would have treated an international issue differently. But for him to kind of call out the Prime Minister being confrontational, I agree with him. It's just very ironic for him to say it. But there's something said to be there. And it makes me think it's not a diplomatic victory. Maybe perhaps it's a concession. Maybe it's a way to try to gracefully back away from a situation that you started that does not have a positive resolution for you, that is not a win, but could be a defeat, and now you're trying to craft it not as a defeat, but maybe as a win-win. We'll have to wait and see more on this. We have Digger Martin on the line. Caller, good morning, you're on here. Morning.
Hi, good morning, Mrs. Wall. Hello? Hello?
Yes, hello, caller.
Yes, Mrs. Wall. Digger Martin here.
Yes,
I just called for my sympathy with Miss Karen and hope that she gets better soon. And, you know, I was watching the program that she was on yesterday, and I felt so sad to see that, you know, the way things turned.
Mm-hmm.
And when the Qatari program shortly after, so I don't know what else happened after that. But I thought she was, in my opinion, I figured out what happened there is that brain like a stop or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So she just kept bend the walk. But I felt so too because only last week I told her I find she's aging so gracefully, and you know, I was really sad to see that.
Mm-hmm.
I wish her all the best and keep her on my prayers and hope that she will get a speedy recovery. Thank you, Sean. You try and have a good day and keep your spirits up as well.
Thank you, caller. Yeah, it was that was one of the odd things yesterday on just trying to go through the day, you know, waiting. So then what do? Do you just continue to enjoy your day as normal or do whatever it is that you had to do or what? Until I got word that she was okay, I was unsettled, and as were other people who wanted to find out, you know, is she okay? That ultimately was the most important question. And again, I guess on some level, perhaps within the next few days or within the next week, even if she's not on the show, I'll get a chance to talk to her, and I'm fingers crossed that what I was led to believe, and again, I didn't speak to Karen, I didn't speak to a doctor, obviously, so I don't know exactly what's going on, but I'm fingers crossed that it's as safe as can be. We have a Remoni line, quick. Caller, good morning, you're on here. Morning.
I just want to take more noise in this month. I just want this to form the level and the I bless you again. All the best. All callers and to family boxes. And talk I can't hear one Yama. There is no much I'm learning. Let's take it more. Thank you.
All right, caller, thank you. I mean, I'm not sure if the audience was able to have a better job. I couldn't make out most of what you said, but I'm assuming it was to offer thoughts and prayers for Karen, and if so, you know, I'm sure she appreciates it. Especially, well, I did make out the fact that you did say you were traveling, and I appreciate the attempt, even if it wasn't obviously the best circumstances. You know, and perhaps I'll say this. I'll say this. Well, now, first of all, and let this be a lesson to commissioners of police and politicians, touting your own horn doesn't always come across very well. But let me tout her horn. I think I would have appreciated such a call if it was sentiments to support her. In the sense of, look, the situation is not the best, but you're going to do it anyway. And one of the issues I think that we have as a people is we are like, well, it's not the right time. I don't have time to do that now. I don't have time to get involved. I can't do this, and it's not the right time for that. And there's always these things in the way and these obstacles. But watching two nephews and a godson and his older siblings, and looking at now all of my classmates, not all, but some have children, some have relatively older children, you know, and just watching how we don't realize how fast life moves, you know, and you see that with athletes who, they don't realize that they're too old until their body tells them in a lot of cases, hey, you can't jump like that anymore. You can't be aggressive like that. Your knees can't take it. You ain't that fast, and you ain't gonna recover as quick. You know, and it hits athletes like a ton of bricks. You know, and with this World Cup, Ronaldo is basically looking at the fact that his dream of winning a World Cup for Portugal is potentially just, it's done. You know, can he last another 4 years to try again? You know, Neymar retired and he wasn't even as old as Ronaldo, from what I understand. It's never the right time. But then when is the right time? When the kids are grown? When you're financially secure? I mean, one of the reasons why we have falling birth rates around the world is it's never the right time to have kids. Until your biological clock is up against the wall. And I think for a lot of situations, for national issues, it's never the right time. And we need to stop doing that. For too many reasons, too many of the best of us don't get involved. And similar to the nursings, those who are well-intentioned and are capable, who do get involved, they are essentially fighting an uphill battle against the system. So, I'll end with that. I'll end with that there. However ugly you think the politics are, however unfortunate you think our national situation is, I think one of the most important differences between the old-time days and now is the fact that for whatever reason, politics has morphed into something that it wasn't quite what it used to be. Politics now is almost a completely ugly word, where everyone who practices it is going to be viewed with suspicion. And because of that, too many of our young people decline from attempting to make a difference in the country. The risk isn't worth it. They rather keep their head down, make their way in life, and hope that whatever off-the-wall comment they make doesn't lead themselves to be arrested, or they leave. And that is the reality of Trinidad and Tobago in 2026. A nation that has no real vision, no real direction, and whose future prospects are predicated more on fate than by our own internal determination. Because dare I say, do you have a vision? Yes, there was your Vision 2020 and now Vision 2030. But what is your vision for the country moving forward? 10, 20, 30 years from now. Some of you might be so old you're saying, well, my vision for 30 years from now doesn't matter. All right, but what about the people younger than you? Those of you who have kids, well, your children who are young adults to adults now, with regards to my viewers, at least a lot of you, they're supposed to be inheriting this country. That's the whole point of a society, to build a nation, and slowly over successive generations we're supposed to make it better and better. Are we? What is the vision for that process? Do you have it? Maybe your vision extends beyond what you will live to see. Have you imparted it on your children? Do they have one? Because if we have no expectations for ourselves in the future, we have nothing to fight for. We have nothing to hope for. We'll be just another state that suffers at the mercy of the turbulence of whatever challenges that we face in the moment, whatever challenges we make for ourselves. And honestly, to borrow a line from a movie, that type of existence, well, it's a paraphrase, is as fragile and as fleeting as tears in the rain. Thanks to the callers for calling in. Closing out the week, this is Talking About the WESN show. Michael Small reminding you, have a good day. You know, thank goodness Karen's okay, so we could all, those of us at least who care about her, could rest a little bit easier with that knowledge. So have a good weekend also. Remember your leaders to the Republic and to each other. Don't forget it's nice to be nice, especially given the fact that you never know what could happen. So do your best so that we could see each other next week. Bye-bye.
WESN.
This is 10 Questions. I'm Andy Johnson. Welcome, everybody. Let's just tell you what's happening around here at this time. The question is crime in Trinidad and Tobago, what to do about it. I wish to pursue from a standpoint of the government went for a state of emergency to address the crime problem, but the fact seems to be that that is not working. More crimes of all sorts seem to be taking place with no sense of fear or prevention by those involved. What is the reason for this? The sense of weakness from those in authority. What steps must be taken now? What may be driving it? What seems to be emboldening the criminals? Where do we go from here? What is left to be done? Has everything not been tried to this point? We're going to continue with states of emergency. My guest for this discussion on the program, Mr. Issa Mohammed. He's chairman of the Project 600 committee. We're going to start by welcoming him, but ask him, tell us a little bit of what Project 600 is. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you so much, Andy. A pleasant good morning to yourself and to all your viewers, and thanks for